Hi all, I have a really conceptually interesting game to show you today. Very instructive, I think, you'll find. It's Leela against Fire 8. This is in TCEC Season 19, Premier Division. Let's have a look. The opening book given, C4, Knight F6, Knight C3, G6. We go into a King's Engine by transposition. And traditionally, Leela does well in such King's Engine style positions. We have Bishop G4, Bishop E3, Knight FD7, and now Knight G1. This is a move I find very interesting to tackle this annoyance on D4. Black sometimes trying to snap off on F3 and weaken D4 and maybe even play E5 or C5 later. So this directly challenges that at the cost of a retreat, and it is an interesting move to consider. We have Bishop takes E2, Knight G takes E2. And now black puts pressure on D4 anyway. By the way, we ended book here with Bishop takes E2, just to be clear. Bishop takes E2 was the end of the book given to both. So Knight G takes E2, C5, and now D5, A6, A4, Queen A5, Bishop D2, and we have Knight E5. And it looks as though it's hitting C4, technically, and D3. Do we need to worry? Well, not so much about D3, apparently. B3 just allowing the check. The king goes to F1, but big deal. The pawn here wants to go to be a form pawn, of course. This is a Leela game. Once we have a form pawn and a few hundred moves of endless shuffling, then there should be an exchange sacrifice, and then pawns will drop off, and the knights will be much better than the opponent's rooks, and that will be the end of the game. So that's the basic recipe. So we have Knight D7, H4, trying to install the form pawn. Okay, Leela is in action here. Knight F6, F3, Queen D8. We have G3, giving the king G2 if needed, E6, Bishop G5, Knight B4, Queen D2, as though an exchange of bishops might be interesting. E takes, E takes, so not C takes, E takes, keeping a more symmetrical pawn structure here. You can see that there's 4 pawns against 4 here locked in. Queen D7, King G2 using that G2 square, B5, an attempt at counterplay. That's kind of ignored with H5. So here it's very, very interesting. Knight takes H5 looks intuitively a bad idea because white can maybe play G4 and Bishop H6. We have that not being played. B takes. We have H6. Not even opening up the H file. This is logic defying, isn't it? Why wouldn't you want to open up the H file? Well, maybe, you know, there's some counterplay with the F file. If you play HG, you're inviting maybe some play against F3, you know, the F file in general. So it does suppress that. And also, I would argue, the form pawn sometimes improves the climate for knights. I think Nimzovich, you know, may have emphasized to us about closed positions, creating a nice climate for knights, but also form pawns, because we're kind of asphyxiating the opponent's king for a smothered mate potential quite often. So it does create, in a way, a better climate for the knights, I would argue. So we have Bishop H8, B takes C4. So minimized counterplay by symmetrical pawns, blockage rather than opening, which would allow opening for black, semi-open F-file counterplay. We have Queen F5, Rook AC1. We have Knight D7. If Knight D3 here, this fails tactically. Can you see what white does here to refute this? Tactically, Knight D3. This is quite interesting. Little sideline. White to play here, if I give you 5 seconds, what would you play with white? And what is the follow-up, more importantly, or just as importantly? Okay, the queen has the responsibility of protecting the knight, so G4, trying to nudge the queen away. And if knight takes G4, can you see the point, really? It would be knight G3. That's the safe way to nudge the queen away. And then we can just take the knight. So yeah, that little mechanism stops knight D3. And, you know, if you said FG, you're just in trouble after queen F2 check. queen f3, bishop e5. Black's pieces come to life, and it's splat for the white king most of the time. It's going to be bad, or this is a disaster. If we look at this again, instead of king h2 there, if we look at knight g3, again bishop e5, and knight f2 check, knight takes g4 check, and then coming into e4, too much pressure on white here. White's just losing lots of bits. And yeah, and there's no problem at all. Black's material up. So yeah, a little sideline note there. Knight d3 is not possible because of g4. There are not too many tactics in this game that I want to explain, so this is one of the variations. So knight d7, we have knight e4, knight e5, bishop f4 shielding f3. Clearly there was some common square f3 there. We have queen d7, and now you might find this a bit strange. Bishop takes e5. With the form pawn, we want white's knights to be maximized, so we have bishop takes e5, and so white has an extra knight here to play with in that kind of closed context, and the form pawn does kind of close the position a little bit more than it would have been. Clearly, we have the knights reinforcing each other. Black dare not play f5. Black played f6, and if f5, the Karpovian, e6 square, you just go into the e6 and start, the Karpovian strangulation procedure. this would be a massive knight on e6. You can't tolerate this knight on e6, basically. White definitely has a big advantage there. So rook he1, and so this f6, but I find this conceptually fascinating, that we consider sometimes our pieces when they're outside of the pawn chain to be more advantageous than within the pawn chain. I would say, having seen this game a few times, that there's a micro downside of this bishop outside of the pawn chain. It is subject to frontal pressure, and as such, it is prone to an exchange sacrifice. White has an extra knight. An exchange sacrifice could improve the knight by undermining pawns. In the case of this, then c5 would be weaker, for example. Or the other one, g5 might be weaker if there's a pawn later on g5. So is it a constant liability, basically, this piece outside of the pawn chain? Conventional logic, gives us the idea we should disregard openings like the French defence, because there's a bishop inside the pawn chain. Here there's a bishop outside the pawn chain, and there still might be a subtle micro downside here. It's subject to an exchange sack in this particularly closed position with symmetrical pawns. So let's see. Rook he1, rook a e8, rook e2, king h8, and the rook's double, g5. Now with g5, this extra little, this downside of the exchange sack, theoretical possibility, is increased, because there's a responsibility of the f6 pawn for g5. There's a responsibility of d6 for c5 here. And it's this centerpiece which, because it's exposed outside of the pawn chain, you might think that's really, really great, but not really seeing it as having a micro downside here. Let's see. Knight f2, rook g8, knight c e4, rook e f8. If f5, actually, which way would you take here? Pop quiz. How would you play this if I give you 5 seconds? So f5 didn't occur, but actually it turns out knight takes c5 is stronger than knight takes g5. So this way is just really strong. That's just really strong for white. So yeah, f5 is unplayable because of knight takes c5 here. So the rooks are not double just for nothing. They do mean, they're combining on e5 here sometimes tactically because of knight takes c5, for example. So, okay, we have rook e f8, queen d1, queen f7, and now knight g4, rook g6. If f5 here, this form pawn acts as a goal hanger. This would be illegal in football. And this variation shows why. This is illegal. It's like being able to easily score, against the goalie, you know, the king. Because can you see what white can play here? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video. Okay. Bang! Knight takes d6. You didn't see that, did you, with the form pawn? Because after bishop takes, we have queen a1 check. No, this isn't obvious stuff. The form pawn is like winning material here. This is just lethal. And we can even sadistically leave the pin and take the rook. Even there is an improvement. It's totally winning for white. So, knight g4, rook g6, a5. This is just pure sadism, saying to black, you know, come and take my a5 pawn, because I might want to sort of use the a file later. After you've taken the a pawn, that's another inroad for me later. So Via is thinking, should I take this pawn or not? Queen b1 is not quite decided. Keep staring at it. White's not going to invest any defence. In fact, there's no, you know, apart from the queen. No, not even the queen. I mean, what can defend it anyway? The bishop's is doing a good job and the knight's doing a good job. And there's no way of defending that pawn anyway. It's just been offered there. Just later, create an inroad. So we have here knight e3. And the queen does take. If the queen tries to protect the f5 square with queen d7, then knight f2. And if taking the h6 pawn, we see the form pawn has played a transition now. It's sacrificed itself for the h-file attack. After knight f5, if rook g6, the h-file attack is pretty vicious. For example, like this, you can see knight takes d6 here, as an example, with queen takes g6, and knight takes f6, and look at that killer common square. Everything's converging on h7 here, or queen g8 mate is threatened. So if check, this is just pure desperation, yeah. It's going to be checkmate, basically. And if we look at that again, you know, trying to protect f5, this was just a question I had. So knight f2, rook takes, knight f5. If rook h5 instead, what we do is g4, and that rook's embarrassed. And then even better than taking a rook is actually f4. So after takes, we've opened up the e file, otherwise it was just taking a rook in broad daylight for nothing. But here, bang, and rook e7, and we've got the killer h7 square, forking queen and h7. So yes, queen d7 seems futile to defend the f5 square. So knight f2, so we have actually, instead of queen d7, trying to play defensively, it's no point, it seems. We have queen takes a5, materialism, knight f5. So the knights, they take me back to an era, the Basman era. And in the Basman era in the UK, if you played in the quick plays, you would know when Basman dominated and then Peter Large, when they dominated, they really dominated. And they had different styles. And the Basman games, he often had gigantic knights, which looked a bit like this. Game after game after game. Even Botvinnik had praised Basman for his positional understanding. If Basman had played, you know, maybe better openings, he'd probably be, you know, a grandmaster. But in that time of Basman, being an IM was a major, major, major achievement. You know, and he had these horrendous, you know, knights, as if stamping his positional authority over you. You know, you are bunnies, I am Basman, I am Basmaniac. I will use the grob, I will get the huge knights. You will positionally suffer a large number of moves. And Leela carries on this Basman style here. So we have after queen e8. We have Leela, thankfully, you know, Leela gives me the license to cover this game and tries to obscure it from all the other YouTubers by having a long period of what seems to be endless configurational shuffling. It's as if Leela is running thousands of automated unit tests against the opponent's position now. So at move 41, rook e3, we have g4 supporting the f5 knight, and now we start this period of shuffling. And this means I'm going to be the only one checking out this astounding game. But, as I say, the e5 piece, just to remind you, in my view, has this micro downside that an exchange sack one day is going to be possible. And one day, either c5 or g5 is going to be weakened as a result. So we have this period of shuffling. Okay, the pawn goes to a4, but so what? You know, there are certain things you can chill out about when you're playing, you know, massive positional chess. Strategic, you know, is the word you'd use rather than positional. It's that level of authority. You start using the word strategic. Strategically crushing chess, not positional chess. Strategically crushing chess here. This endless shuffling until we're going to get this exchange sacrifice here. This exchange sacrifice is going to come here. It's past move 100, 109. It's here, wake up. It's here. The exchange sacrifice, behold its power. Rook takes e5. Yes. Black's pawn chain is being undermined. White has taken out the option to undermine the black pawn chain. These gigantic knights in the position will run riot here with the queen. So we have d takes e5. If f takes e5, then knight e4, you know, it hits d6, it hits g5, and the queen can also participate in hitting g5. For example, here, this is just running riot over the black position. And, you know, rook takes a4. Yeah, the queen can even step backwards to win a4, because that's another kind of liability left. And then knight takes d6 shows the power of the form pawn. You know, if takes, then there's mating. So yeah, it's all a bit of a nightmare in that variation. Let's have a look at that again. So that was an f takes. We're saying that's a bit of a nightmare here. So knight takes g8, queen d1, rook takes a4. It's all a bit of a nightmare. And you might ask, well, you know, not knight d3. What about e4, trying to give black some counterplay? It doesn't matter. We just play it a different way with queen c6. And then things drop off. This is just winning for white. Yeah, we don't want to give counterplay here. Instead of queen c6, if too greedy, then black combines and checkmates white, which is not going to happen here. So anyway, so in a nutshell, d takes e5 was chosen, not f takes e5. So it didn't matter, you know, f takes e5, it does seem to lose anyway. So d takes e5, and we have this kind of casualness about winning c5, which is very important. c5 needs to be taken in the right circumstances, absolutely perfect circumstances. King h3, because if knight takes c5 here, this is terrible circumstances to win that pawn. After queen c7 and queen takes c4, black will be winning. So king h3, the damage has been done, and also there's a passed pawn here as well. So there's a weakened c5 pawn. We have the rooks doing nothing in this position because they have nothing to do because it's such a closed, locked-in position. So queen f8 was played. If rook b8, can you guess what white plays here? Tactical test. What does white play here, which wins? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video here. Okay. Knight takes g5. It just wrecks the pawn chain and wins tons of material. For example, here, bang, bang, take both rooks. And here, by the way, if knight takes c5, that's not as good actually, but it's still a small advantage for white, but it's not as good. Okay, so after queen e2, queen f8, we now have queen f2. Yes, there is an interest in winning c5. And note, you know, this rook is really quite cheeky. It's stopping the use of d3, as well as blocking black's outside passed pawn, which, you know, normally you think is pretty dangerous. Or normally you think a knight's kind of dangerous, but neither are dangerous here. It seems the whole focus, you know, is on these characters, on black's pawns here. It seems other things just are not in the equation here. Rook c7, we have king g3. This is just luxury. White is able to toy with the opponent here. Queen e2 in such a closed position where the knights are so neatly visually perched. So rook b7. So the knights, yes, like Basman knights. So queen e2, rook b a7, king h3. Yes, it's a luxury to be able to do this shuffling here, the exchange down. But what is black able to do with the rooks? We have an invasion, knight g7, king g3, queen e2, and more high-level shuffling. So just taking stock of things, teasing the rooks, saying, what can you do? What can you do? Nothing. And white is in certainly no rush to gain the c5 pawn. So we have here shuffling until here. Now d6 is used actually. So this means c5 is going to be slightly weaker, and both knights support this thrust. d6, rook a5, now knight g7. So the rook is artificially placed on a5 here. Yes, knight c6, and now the queen makes use of the kind of weakness of the last move here and invades the d5 square. It's been invited to invade d5. We have knight d8. The knight's going passive. Look at white's knights compared to the black knight. The rook's still completely useless in this climate. Knight h5. And this reminds me of a quotation given to Garry Kasparov in his advice. Someone gave him advice, I think maybe Spassky, on how to beat Petrosian. And it was hold both balls tight was the advice given to Kasparov, and he did beat Petrosian. So holding both balls, with the balls here at c5 and f6, yes? Queen f7, we have queen d2. This is much better than queen takes f7. Yeah, the queen is still very handy to have around, because this situation might actually be just even. So queen d2 keeps all the pressure. We have knight e6. If queen takes c4, then d7, and this situation, yeah, the knights take out the protector. And yes, it's funny that all of black's pawns are kind of fragmented here. And that one's virtually fragmented because of the form pawn. Look at this fragmentation here, and yes, they are all like ripe apples. And yes, I have been eating some ripe apples from my own garden recently. So knight b7, queen b4. This is a variation, by the way. Sorry, I'm just going to clarify that this is a variation. Yes, queen e7, queen takes g5, knight e6, queen h5, queen f5, and white will have an advantage. So, yes, I hope you're convinced. Queen takes c4. Let's just recap this variation. If the queen had taken on c4 here, because this is the sort of question I guess that would be asked here, isn't it a free pawn? So knight e6 was played. If queen takes c4, let's recap. We're saying we push the pawn, we take out f6, we invade with the queen, we play around with the queen until g5 is about to drop off. They're all dropping off, aren't they, basically? And then, yeah, it's just a massive position. And the queen and knight, are installed here. The queen can't move because of h7. It's just going to increase this position. Anyway, so knight e6 was played. And here, yeah, knight e takes f6. So now e5 and g5 need the help of pieces rather than the f6 pawn. So they have extra caring needs now, e5 and g5. We have rook 5 to a7. The queen invades again, knight f8. And now queen takes c5. So we have the potential for two connected passed pawns here. If queen takes e5 here, let's just quickly investigate this. Knight d7 check and queen g7 is also strong. But black can improve there with queen e6, and this situation is still actually, even here, would be nice for white. And just to show you the climate of this position, rook takes a4 shows the form pawn is ready to mate with the knights. If rook takes a4, then knight f7 is checkmate. And if rook e7, then the knights dominate the rooks here. And in fact, this is good for white as well. So anyway, so queen takes c5 was played, not queen takes e5. Although it seems, e5 is also good. But knight g6 was played. We have knight e4, queen f8, king g3. Yeah, and the knight holds f4. So queen b8, queen b5, wanting an exchange of queens. And yeah, we're going to test the climate of the rooks versus the knights here. knight f8 with the pawn pawn. You know, it's an extra closed position. The potential for smothering mating the king is higher with the pawn pawn. Knight hf6. Now knight d5. Now this pawn drops. Yeah, it's just too much pressure to bear here, really. So that pawn's given up. Sorry, also, by the way, if rook g8, we can, just for fun, see another smothered mate. Knight f7. So rook a8, knight e6, knight ec7, knight e7, knight c6, and white is winning an exchange. And knight takes a4, rook takes d6. If rook a8, you might ask, yes, the knight will dominate the rook here. Look at this. The knight just dominates the rook. This is a big advantage there. And also, if you want to explore that a little bit more, if knight c4, this variation is also strong for white. The knight dominates the rook here. I mean, it's just too much for the rook to handle this situation. So let's go back. So rook takes d6. We have g5. It's all over, isn't it? It's 2 pawns up for white. The knight comes to the massive e4 square. The rook starts torture as well. Pass pawn is massive. Yeah, it looks absolutely all over. That facilitates queening. In fact, I've gone past the end of the game. Pardon me. I'll rewind. Knight e7 was the end of the game. That's it. Black had actually given up here. If it did continue, then knight c5 as mentioned. b7. And knight d7 would be crowning that queen or winning material. So yeah, I'll take you to the game end position. So what I got from this game, it does seem to be a standard recipe is emerging. Install the form pawn, because opening up lines might give the opponent counterplay. Have fantastic knights. Do an exchange sack at some point. With the queen and your knights, just start destroying the opponent's pawns, munching pawns like ripe apples. Then maybe you're going to win one of the exchanges back and just win the endgame. Yeah, it seems to be a very standard, solid recipe which somehow has been evolved from all this self-training. It is a revolutionary way of playing chess. But somehow it does also remind me of Michael Basman games at those quick plays with his gigantic knights. Anyway, so I hope you enjoyed that as much as me. Yeah, I really did enjoy this one today. It seems, conceptually interesting. That's why this is not just another game. It seems to have, some new conceptual interest for me. And I hope you found it interesting. Okay. And, yeah, I haven't got any of my links, I've just realised. This is my course template with no distractions. So anyway, if you want to check out my new course, Kingscrusher.tv, it's got this clean template with no distractions. /Kingscrusher.tv/opening tango. And, playlists are at bit.ly/Leela chess or bit.ly/stockfish chess. If you want to invite me for a game, just use Kingscrusher.tv. That will take you to Chessworld. Register there and I'll be able to invite you for a game after. Okay. Thanks very much. Comments, questions, likes, shares, subscribes with the notification bell. Really appreciated. Thanks very much.